Bueno, ¿qué tal? Vamos a comenzar con esta conferencia de Mark Skousen. Profesor, doctor Mark Skousen tiene un PhD en Economics de George Washington University. Ha publicado una gran cantidad de libros, entre ellos Economic Logic, que es muy bueno. Nosotros lo usábamos en nuestra maestría de la Universidad Francisco Marroquín en Guatemala. Y Mark tiene esa habilidad de pocos, por lo menos economistas dentro de la escuela austríaca, de poder unir o ligar la teoría con actividades empresariales. La más exitosa debe ser Freedom Fest. Freedom Fest es una actividad donde junta como 400 o más personas, no, 2,000 persons, que van a Los Ángeles. No sé si por el Freedom Fest o por Los Ángeles, pero creo que es una muy buena actividad empresarial. Fue presidente de Foundation for Economic Education, y de esta facultad de Rosario nosotros mandábamos, yo fui director del departamento de economía aquí, y enviábamos alumnos a FI por unos 2 meses, y ellos tenían un training, ahí trabajaban, y Mark ha sido uno de los presidentes que recibió a nuestros alumnos. Antes estaba Hans Senholz, que iniciamos el programa con él. Los invito, esta página que tienen ahí de mskousen.com es la página del lado académico de Skousen, y tienen otra que él no la está poniendo acá, pero la recomiendo, que es igual, markskousen.com, donde van a tener todo lo que es el asesoramiento financiero, que es muy bueno, y con técnicas de forecasting. De manera que aquí Mark entonces nos va a presentar esta especie de mezcla entre economía y práctica. Mark, thank you very much, and you are in charge.
Thank you. And we'll use this? Okay. Well, it's a delight to be here. Es un placer estar aquí. I'm going to speak in English, and I hope to talk about something that's very dear to my heart. But let me first begin by telling you my favorite Milton Friedman story, since yesterday we were discussing my book, Vienna and Chicago, Friends or Foes. So I had the opportunity in the mid-1980s to attend a conference in California, at Laguna Beach, California, overlooking the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean. And I called Milton Friedman up and I said, can we have lunch together? And he said, yes, that would be fine. So just the two of us went out overlooking the ocean and had this wonderful lunch together for a couple of hours. And we talked about all kinds of things. And when it was finished, the bill came, and I immediately grabbed the bill and I said, so all my life, Mr. Friedman, I've heard your statement, there's no such thing as a free lunch. And I don't want to ever hear this again because I'm paying for yours. And quick as a wink, he said, no, Mark, that was not a free lunch. I had to listen to you for 2 hours. So anyway, that's my Milton Friedman story. I'm talking today about something which I think is extremely important. I consider this development of the gross output statistic here to be the biggest triumph in Hayekian Austrian macroeconomics since Hayek won the Nobel Prize 40 years ago. And I will try to make that case here today with the talk about gross output, GO, and its relationship to GDP. basically, I have a couple of quotes here. This is the first quote here from some pretty establishment economists. Dale Jorgensen, Stephen Landfeld. Mr. Landfeld was the director of the Bureau of Economic Analysis that proposed that gross output be adopted on a quarterly basis along with GDP. So the BEA is the government agency that releases the GDP on a quarterly basis, the official government agency, and now they are also releasing gross output. And then also Bill Nordhaus, who is the co-author of the Samuelson textbook. So we're seeing here Keynesian economists also recognizing the value of gross output. I think that's really important. So this is based on my book, The Structure of Production, that I wrote in 1990, where I made the case for gross output. I actually called it gross national output. And so we've been arguing about the terminology ever since. But in 1990, this book published by NYU Press, I made the case that gross output is a statistic, a very important macroeconomic tool that should be used by economists and introduced to the as a point of discussion about the economy. So to understand what gross output is, I begin with a micro model which everyone can understand, and that's how a cup of coffee is produced. And this is taken from John Taylor, who is one of the finest economists in the country. He's known for the Taylor Rule. If you're not familiar with the Taylor Rule, he's the founder of this. He's at Stanford University, and John Taylor uses this in his textbook. So you see here we have the first stage of the coffee grower, and he's adding value by growing and packaging or picking the coffee berries. And then we go here to the second stage of the coffee roaster, where he adds value by roasting and packaging the coffee, and then coffee beans, and then it's passed on to the wholesaler, the distributor, who adds value with shipping and wholesale markets onto the roasted and packaged beans, and finally delivered to Caribou Coffee House in Minneapolis, where the added value is added with the espresso machine and development of the actual coffee that is then served to the consumer. So you'll notice here we have 4 stages in the micro model. We're adding value at each stage, and this is a great representation of the production process, the structure of production on a micro level. So what I did was taking the 4-stage micro model and now making it a macro model. And so I have a 4-stage macro model that I have developed here, and a universal model that applies to all goods and services. All goods and services go through these 4 stages of production. So we start off with the resource stage, then the resources are then produced and put in a way that is more useful, and then it's distributed, and finally it is consumed by either business or the consumer in final output. What's nice about this model is it's a great way to show the relationship between the production process and final output, or GDP. And so it's a concept that I have incorporated, that I developed in the Structure of Production, and then I incorporated it in my economic logic textbook. The biggest breakthrough about this is that this is kind of an Austrian perspective, because what did Menger talk about in his book, the Grundsatz? He made the case that we need to focus on goods along a production process. And he talked about goods of the first order and goods of the second order, and basically higher order versus lower order goods. So if you haven't read that, it's a great book. I actually dedicated my book, The Structure of Production, to Carl Menger because of his emphasis on goods rather than income in the production process, rather than the distribution of income, which is often the focus of other textbooks. And that makes his contribution unique, and that's how he developed his marginal theory of the markets. So finally, we have a full picture of the economy. So what I did was develop this model here where you have the production process over time, value added as we move toward final goods and services, which is measured by GDP. So my gross output statistic is this right here, this part. It reaches a pinnacle with the production process of final goods and services, GDP. And then once final goods are produced, they are sold and consumed and depreciate in value as they are consumed. Whether it is tools and equipment in the business sector or houses and goods and services that you purchase, they're all consumed over a period of time. So this is a general equilibrium model of the economy, is what I've developed here. And again, one that I've put in my economic logic textbook. So I want to show you why gross output is so important by showing you one of the problems with just focusing on GDP. GDP, it represents the value of finished goods and services, all right? And that's very important. And unfortunately, that's often ignored by the media. What happens is the media sees GDP as a statistic that represents or measures the economy in general. What is the economy? Well, it's GDP. And so when you do that, it creates a problem. Because as you can see here, if you look at the breakdown of GDP of the use economy, this is for 2013, you'll see that consumption expenditures is the largest sector. It is 68.5% of the U.S. economy. While gross private investment is 15.9%, government expenditures, purchases of goods and services is 18.6%, and then exports, we are net importers of 3%. So if you were to rank these in terms of importance, you would put consumption first, government second, and business third. All right? So what are the conclusions when you use GDP as the only measure of the economy? Well, you come to some very dangerous conclusions. One of which is that consumer spending drives the economy. It's a very common myth that is promoted every month. That data comes out on retail sales, for example, consumer spending. There's always this statement, consumer spending makes up more than 70% of the economy. What's the basis of that? GDP. And it usually drives growth during economic recoveries. This is from New York Times. Here's something just from a couple months ago from the Wall Street Journal, just to show it's not just the New York Times, it's also the Wall Street Journal. Household spending, meaning consumer spending, generates more than 2/3 of the total economic output. Look at the term there for GDP, total economic output. So sturdy spending gains should translate into economic growth. So if only the consumer will spend more money, you see, and if the consumer doesn't spend more money, then who steps in? Well, the second biggest sector, which is government. And you see that with this statement from the New York Times in 2011, second quarter GDP, it talks about the decline in public spending does mention investment, but notice here, the astonishingly slow growth rate from April through June was due in large part to sluggish consumer spending and an increase in imports. Oh, terrible. Imports increased. That hurt GDP, which subtracted from growth numbers. I mean, can you see what is happening here is that as professors, and we have a lot of professors here, when you teach students just GDP, this is what you get. You get a real misconception of how the economy works. And then it says, but dwindling government spending also held back growth. So you see, any effort to cut back on government spending is going to hurt GDP, ergo is bad. And this is one of your problems in Argentina, because in Argentina, just like all other countries, you focus on GDP. And what is a big sector of GDP? Government spending. So if you increase government spending, if you build a road out in the middle of nowhere, on the road to Chile or something, you see, it's going to increase GDP. So I think I have some real problems with this general approach here. Murray Rothbard, who's one of our favorite Austrian economists, you know what he used to say about GDP? It should be C plus I minus G. So anyway, so let's go back to what we have here. I think if we go back to a complete view of the economy, we'll recognize the importance of GDP. I'm not dismissing GDP. I think it plays an important role, and it should not be ignored and taken out of the textbook. I'm not making that argument at all. What I'm arguing is that GDP is the value of finished goods and services only, and not total economic output. And if you want total economic output, you have to add this, plus this, plus this, plus this. You have the whole economy being measured there. Now, one of the problems with this GDP-only statistic is that it contradicts economic growth statistics. And that's the point I want to make here with the leading economic indicators. Almost every major country, I don't know about Argentina, but I do know that almost every G20 country has a leading economic indicator index. And this is the one that's put out by the Conference Board of the United States, and it lists 10 leading indicators. Now, if you look at these indicators, where are they in the production process? And the answer is they're all in the pre-final stage. They're in the earlier stages of production. Manufacturers' new orders, building permits, unemployment claims, manufacturing hours, real money supply, stock prices, the yield curve, new orders for non-defense capital goods, vendor performance, and then finally you have this 10th one, index of consumer expectations. What is it that the media focuses on? All 10 of these leading indicators are cited every month, but they focus only on one. Why? Because consumer spending drives the economy, according to their understanding of GDP. But I will tell you, the people who came up with the index of consumer expectations realized that the questions that they were asking all had to do with business expectations. So they've added business conditions on here. So it's really not. The only real consumer question that is asked in this survey is this question: are you planning a vacation in the next 6 months? The rest of the questions are all about jobs, security, job security. They're questions about, are you going to buy a house, which is really more of a capital good than a consumer good since it lasts so long, and so forth. So that's why they changed the title here. Really, there's nothing in retail spending is not a leading indicator. It's a lagging indicator. So that introduces gross output and my own statistic, which I've now been calling gross domestic expenditures. I'll explain the difference in just a minute. So the idea of gross output and gross domestic expenditures is to measure spending at all stages of production. And that figure can be rather dramatic in what we see in the economy. The breakthrough is this. For years, if I can go back to this graph here, for years, the government did have an annual statistic for gross output, a measure of spending at all stages of production. However, it was 2 to 3 years old. It came out annually and nobody paid any attention. Why? Because, as I said to the BEA over and over again, you need to come out with a quarterly statistic that comes out at the same time as GDP so that the media will pay attention. So you need to bring this data up to date because they get it from the input-output data, which comes out every 5 years and is estimated. It's a real complex issue. So anyway, the big news is that in April of this year, the Bureau of Economic Analysis began publishing for the first time gross output by industry on a quarterly basis right along with GDP. And I believe we handed out, did all of you receive a copy of my press release on this and my Wall Street Journal article? Did they pass that out? Everybody got that? Okay, so you can take a look at my Wall Street Journal article making this announcement. It was the lead editorial on April 23rd of this year of the Wall Street Journal announcing at last a better measure of the economy. And then also, I've been putting out a press release every quarter. They've come out now with 3 quarters of information on the gross output statistic. So Stephen Landfeld, who's the director of the BEA, who supported this idea of producing another statistic of the economy, offers a unique perspective, it says, and a powerful new set of tools of analysis. That's a pretty good endorsement of this concept. So here's their statement in their own press release in April. While many users focus on GDP by industry, gross output by industry is also a highly useful statistic that is published as part of the BEA's industry economic accounts. Gross output is principally a measure of an industry's sales or receipts, which can include sales to final users in the economy or sales to other industries' intermediate inputs. So basically, it's a measure of all 4 stages of production that I had here earlier. Now, if you go back to this 4-stage model of the economy, where did I get this? I got this originally from Hayek's great work, Prices and Production. Prices and Production was published based on a series of 4 lectures that Hayek gave in 1931 at the London School of Economics to give a graphic, a diagram way of explaining the structure of production, these stages of production. However, it really never went anywhere for 2 reasons. One is Hayek's, the Austrian perspective was politically not particularly supportive of the Depression era. Keynesian economics really engulfed the profession, and Austrian economics kind of went the wayside. The other problem was that Hayek maintained a purely theoretical model. He didn't have 4 stages of production that fit government statistics. He never did any empirical work. He never tried to measure Hayek's triangle, so it remained basically adrift. And very few people paid any attention. However, what I've tried to do here is take the skeleton that Hayek created and put on the flesh and blood by adding empirical data, by creating a model that everyone can relate to, the four-stage model of the economy. And as a matter of fact, one of the speakers here who's speaking later this afternoon, Cesar, Daniel, yeah, raise your hand. So his business card, can you see his business card? He's created his business card with the four stages of production. So it's pretty impressive. I was impressed. At any rate, he's giving a talk today about, again, taking the skeleton and putting the flesh and blood with looking at specific statistics of a gross output statistic for one of the provinces of Argentina. So anyway, what's really powerful about this four-stage model is that you can now apply the data that the government issues, and we can do some studies and some empirical work on what is the significance of measuring all four stages of production and the various industries that's involved there. So, Wall Street Journal published my article on April 22nd, 23rd in the print edition. You can see even the cartoonist got it, created the four stages of production, which was pretty amazing for a cartoonist to understand Austrian economics. All right, so I say gross output will correct the fallacy fostered by GDP that consumer spending drives the economy. And then Steve Forbes has been very supportive in Forbes magazine for my new statistic. A new revolutionary way to measure the economy is coming. Believe me, this is a big deal. And in fact, I believe that all G20 countries will adopt gross output as a statistic in addition to GDP. That's coming. It's already started. The UK is doing an annual statistic. They call it total output. When I've given lectures, I had a top economist from Japan and Korea attend one of my lectures. They said, what can we do to create this statistic in Japan and in Korea? The Asians are on top of this faster than any other area of the world. Why? Because gross output is a supply side statistic. It's not just an Austrian statistic, it's supply side because it deals with the production side of the economy. And then we have Steve Hanke from Johns Hopkins University, who actually compares it not just to Austrian, but to Say's law. Supply creates demand. Extremely important concept of emphasizing entrepreneurship and how do you move this production process along. Now, I mentioned that gross output has some problems and why I've had to create my own statistic, gross domestic expenditures. Gross output measures only net figures for wholesale and retail trade. And the quote from David Washauser says, "There's no further transformation of these goods to the production process. They are excluded from wholesale retail trade output." What he's basically saying is, it's almost a mercantilist argument. He's saying that we don't want to include gross wholesale and retail trade because you've already finished, the product is already finished. It's a finished good, and so we just need to measure net contributions or value added after that point. As a result, gross output leaves out $7 trillion of spending in their statistics. Nevertheless, it is a move in the right direction, and I'm willing to live with it as a statistic. So my new statistic, GDE, includes spending at all stages of production and not just part of them in the distribution phase. So my statistic includes gross, wholesale, and retail trade. Now, you can't see these numbers very well. I don't know. They don't seem to show up particularly well. Can you see those at all? I don't think you can you? So I might as well skip this graph in a sense, but the top part is GDP, and we're comparing it to gross output and gross domestic expenditures. Let me just say that according to 2014, the latest data, GDP is $17 trillion. Gross output is $31 trillion. Gross domestic expenditures, which is truly the full measure of economic spending, is $38 trillion. So you can see that the production process is even bigger than the final output that is involved. That's basically what this chart shows. Now, I think you can see here some really interesting statistics on the ups and downs of the economy comparing GDP with gross domestic expenditures. The first thing you'll notice, here's red is GDP. This part right here is 2008-2009 recession. Nominal GDP fell only 2% during the Great Recession. The question you must ask yourself is, GDP, does it do a very good job of describing what happened during the Great Recession? The answer is no. A 2% decline is a decline, but it's not much. And one of the reasons is government's such a big sector, and it's always increasing to counter the fall off in private investment and consumption. But if you look at GDE, total spending in the economy, during the recession, see how it drops further. This dropped 6%, 3 times more, and therefore did a much better job of reflecting how deep the recession was of 2008-2009. The other thing, during the boom phase, notice that gross output grows faster, or that is gross domestic expenditures and gross output grows faster during the recovery stage. So it's like Hayek said in Prices and Production. During the contraction, or during the expansion phase, the earlier you add more stages of production, you do more outsourcing. You're growing and you're expanding the number of stages. During the collapse, during the contraction of the economy, you're depending more on inventories. You're drawing from inventories, so production is even less in the earlier stages of production. As a result, you can see why you have much greater volatility in gross domestic expenditures and gross output than you do with final output, as the theory predicts. So the data is definitely supporting the Hayekian Austrian macro view of the Austrian theory of the business cycle. This can give you a sense of gross domestic expenditures and intermediate inputs. It gives you the total gross output. You can see again the major sell-off right here during the recession. It's pretty substantial. Percentage change from quarter to quarter. What we have here in the red line is intermediate inputs. So it's everything except GDP, except the final. It's just this red line represents the first 3 stages of the 4-stage model of the economy. And look how far that dropped. And then the blue line is gross output, and then the green line is GDP. So you can see the difference between the 3. Now here we show the conclusion, which is extremely important here when we get back to the idea of what drives the economy. Is it consumer spending? Is it government spending? And is business a poor third? Well, when you use the and that's what you get with the GDP model, you see that consumption is this huge sector, government second, private investment is third. But look what happens when you use the GDE model. So now business, B2B, the business sector is the largest sector of the economy, 62%. Personal consumption, still a very important sector, is 30% of the economy. And government expenditures drops to 8.4% of the economy. and exports and imports is a smaller percentage even then. The point is that the GDE model brings us back to a model that is more consistent with growth theory. As all of the growth theory economists like Robert Barrow or Solow and others have demonstrated, it's on the supply side that economic growth occurs. It's technology, it's productivity, it's not, consumer spending is the effect, not the cause of prosperity. And that's what Say's law says. So it all fits, the GDE model here does a much better job of fitting in with Say's law, with Austrian business cycle theory, and with growth theory. So it's all coming together here. We now have a full picture of how the economy operates, and we have statistics to support it. And this is why this data needs to be incorporated in all the textbooks. I have sent letters to all the textbook writers. 70% of them are incorporating gross output in their very next edition. So it is growing and is becoming very much a part of the way economics is being taught. And these are the top textbooks. It's going to be in Roger Leroy Miller's textbook, Gortney and Stroop. The only one who's a holdout is Greg Mankiw, who says students can't handle looking at these two statistics. It will confuse them. And I said, where do you teach again? You telling me Harvard students can't get what I just explained here? Well, he didn't appreciate that comment, but anyway, Mankiw will eventually be forced to include it because all the other textbooks are including it, and it's a very competitive business. So, breakdown of gross domestic expenditures for 2013. That gives you the numbers here. That shows you how the business sector is by far the largest sector of the economy. And here's a way to show it in the textbook. So you simply add on GDE or gross output, whichever one you want to use, as the beginning chart. And then you have GDP, then net national or domestic product, national income, and personal income figures. Here's a great quote from Larry Kudlow of CNBC, great economist. Though not 1 in 1,000 recognizes it, it is business, not consumers, that is the heart of the economy. When businesses produce profitably, they create income-producing, paying jobs, and then consumers spend. That gets to my view that consumption is the effect, not the cause of prosperity. Profitable firms also purchase new equipment because they need to modernize and update all their tools, structures, and software. Steve Forbes says, the new way to measure the economy, gross output, will have a profound and manifestly positive impact on economic policy. Why? Because now the focus will be how do we improve business conditions rather than how can we get the consumer to stimulate the economy by buying more. There's a big difference. So you're going to focus on productivity, and you're going to focus on profitability. Because what creates, as I tell all my students who are very anxious about the job market in today's world, and I say, here's the key. Study after study shows that companies that make more money, that are more profitable, pay higher wages. You want to increase wages, increase productivity, increase profitability of firms. So if you can increase profitability of firms, they're going to hire more workers and they're going to pay their workers more. And you don't need a minimum wage law to do that. That's one time students actually take notes. Yeah. So what are the issues with gross output and GDE? How are we doing on time?
10 minutes
before questions. Yeah, okay. So one of the big complaints is, isn't GDE, gross output and GDE, isn't that just double counting? And the answer is, it is double counting, but double counting is really important. We must not, dismiss the idea that you can have a complex, sophisticated economy without a lot of B2B activity, a lot of business-to-business transactions, which involves double counting. And what is taking place with double counting? During the production process, does the coffee bean stay the same through the production process? No. The coffee bean is picked, it's roasted, it's crushed. It goes through these production processes that are required. So you can't just dismiss gross output by saying, well, it's just double counting, and why do we need to count it? You need to count it because it's real economic activity. I was talking to Jeremy Siegel of the Wharton School, and he says, you know, I like gross output because it's a measure of the demand for money, because we're talking about real transactions by business people. And so that indicates a demand for money and cash transactions. And that's very real. The other way I like to look at it is this right here. From a finance point of view, top line versus bottom line accounting. So most of you, I presume, have taken accounting. Do you know what I mean by top line versus bottom line? So top line accounting is sales and revenue, and bottom line is earnings or value added. Now, if you are a good analyst, do you just look at the bottom line? Do you just look at profits? Well, I guarantee you, you will not last long as a security analyst if you just look at the bottom line. You must also look, how did you get to the bottom line? What is the production process? What about marketing? What about sales? What about cash flow? What about your product itself? If you are not on top of that, the bottom line is going to eventually suffer. So top line and bottom line, that's what we have here. GDP is the bottom line. But gross output and gross domestic expenditures, that's the top line. And you need them both. They both work together. Number two complaint is outsourcing and vertical integration. There's no doubt if a company merges with another company, gross output declines, while final output does not. But it is a real economic activity and it shouldn't be ignored. Same thing with outsourcing. If you're doing something in your business internally and you suddenly decide to outsource it, gross output grows. GDP may stay the same. So there are features of this that create some uncertainty in the market. But believe me, no statistic is perfect. No statistic is perfect. For example, in GDP, if you are purchasing food on the table, that's part of GDP, isn't it? But if you decide to grow it in your backyard, suddenly it disappears from GDP. Does that mean we should throw away GDP completely? No. And the same thing with the gross output. So nothing is perfect, but you don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Let's see how they translate that. How do you throw the baby out with the bathwater? Is there something, how do they say that in Spanish? Okay. So, conclusions. Consumer spending represents only about a third, not 2/3 of the U.S. economy, as commonly believed. Number two, business investment, broadly defined to include private investment of final capital goods and spending to produce goods in process, business-to-business transactions, is by far the largest sector of the economy. It is business that drives the economy. Third, GDE and gross output are more sensitive to the business cycle than GDP. They're much more cyclical than GDP. So on a more broader scale, what am I saying with my approach to macroeconomics? Number one, the make economy, we must look at the make economy and not just the use economy. Number two, B2B transactions, intermediate inputs, are important, not just B2C or business to consumer transactions. Number 3, relative prices, not just consumer prices. So we want to look at the commodities index. We want to what's happening in the earlier stages of production. What's happening to the producer price index, the PPI. So we're going to look at those things, not just the consumer price index. So we're going to look at price indexes at all stages of production. Number 4, we're not going to look at just the interest rate, which is usually the 10-year Treasury note rate, which is around 2%. We're going to look at the yield curve. So we're going to look at relative interest rates, short-term interest rates, and long-term interest rates. And we're going to look at the yield curve. And it's a very powerful prediction tool on recessions, because in the past 3 or 4 recessions, the yield curve has turned negative and was a very good indicator of a recession. And we're going to look at the structure of employment and unemployment, earlier versus later stages industries. During a recession, mining industries and manufacturing is hurt a lot more than service industries. And then in the stock market, instead of the Dow Jones Industrial Average or the S&P 500, we're going to look at various industries. So we break down the industries. In fact, gross output, I've just been looking at gross output as a single number, but it's also gross output by industry. So they tell you what's happening in the mining industry, manufacturing industry, the service industries. It breaks it down. And this gets back to the great contribution of Wesley Leontief, who won the Nobel Prize for his input-output models. This is very much in the spirit of Leontief. I think it's unfortunate that Simon Kuznets, who's the father of GDP and national income, failed to include gross output and the stages of production. Why? Because he adopted the Keynesian model. In reading the general theory, Kuznets said, oh, it's final effective demand. That's all that matters. Well, what is final effective demand? It's the 4th stage of production. It's the final stage of production. So that's why he said that's all we need to measure. So that was a fundamental error that we're correcting finally here 60 years later. GDP was the great invention of the 1940s, extremely important, but it was incomplete. And now we have gross output, and hopefully the government will see the light and recognize spending at all stages of production, and will adopt the gross domestic expenditures. And that's why we will get a whole new way of looking at the economy. So it's based on my book, The Structure of Production, which got this started in 1990, and finally it's coming to fruition. You've all heard the famous statement that truth progresses funeral by funeral. And it may take another 30 years, who knows, before this becomes totally used. But I do think that this is a tremendous triumph in Hayek's macroeconomics. And I can't help but thinking that he's up in the heavens in the cloud for Austrians. You heard about the different clouds that are up there in the heavens? Okay, I'll end by this and we can open up to questions. So St. Peter goes to the heavens, and God is there to greet Peter, and he said, would you like a tour of the heavens? He said, yeah, I think this would be great. So he comes to one cloud, and he says, well, who are those people? Well, they're polishing the halos, getting the halos ready and so on, and they're all Keynesians. All right? They're working hard, and they're producing as much as they can, spend, and so forth. And he said, okay, that's great. So he comes over to another cloud, and he says, well, who are those guys? Well, they're polishing the harps. And who are those? Well, those are all the Marxists. Okay, that's great. Marxists are there. They're doing really, they feel they're exploited as workers and so forth, but there they are. And finally, they come to another cloud, and it's completely covered, boxed in, so that you can't look in and they can't look out. And he said, well, my gosh, who are those people? And he says, well, those are the Austrians. They think they're the only ones up there with the truth. So, thank you very much.